And I want to thank you personally, along with Joe Walgus, for making this possible. This isn't something that normally happens, and you have friends in high places, and New York City, case in point, they've made this happen. So we thank both of you in particular for making this happen. We've just, I think, enjoyed this film tremendously. I think a round of applause for the lady we have on our screen now. And just by way of introduction, having read the foreword among the book itself on Witness, our recently deceased Richard Holbrook made the comment, the thing that made Ruth Gruber different as a correspondent, there was their concern for the fate of the people as much as telling the story. And coming from that source, Richard Holbrook, it was very importantly and well said. I think, are we ready, Greg? I think without further ado, number one, Dr. Ruth, Doctor, General, Correspondent, Photographer. We don't have time to list all the functions, but we do appreciate it, and we are humbly blessed. And thank you so much for attending and coming to the Circle Cinema in Tulsa, Oklahoma. For that, we again thank you so much. I'll start out, if we have no quick questions. In all your travels, have you ever been to Tulsa, Oklahoma?
In all your travels, have you ever been to Tulsa, Oklahoma?
Indeed, I've been there a number of times, and I've always enjoyed getting there.
Well, you've returned, and for that we thank you. At this time, let me open this up to questions from this audience, who is very smart, or they wouldn't be here to begin with. Good. Some questions, please. Any questions for Dr. Gruber? Yes, of course.
I have a question. I spend a lot of time training journalists how to have compassion, which you surely have. What advice would you give young journalists on how to tell good stories and be compassionate?
Do you want me to repeat it?
Yes.
What advice would you give young journalists in how to be compassionate and tell good stories?
Make sure that you're going to tell the truth. It doesn't matter which side you're on. You must tell the truth. And you must understand what the people you're interviewing are feeling. You must empathize with them. You must interview them not only with your brain, but with your heart. If you're interviewing Holocaust survivors, you might even begin to shed tears. But it's okay, as long as you keep the honesty and the passion and build your story around their feelings and their experiences, and I think you'd be good journalists.
Okay, perfect.
Thank you, Ziva. Thank you, Doctor. Another question, perhaps? Here, back here.
Well, fantastic story, and just so impressed with your life. And question about the interview with the captain of the Exodus, where you and he have a political difference, I guess. That could you explore that a little bit more? What the difference is about Israel, and how you feel about the current state of peace efforts?
The question is about the controversy or the conflict between you and Ike Aronowitz and your feelings about the current state of Israeli politics.
People are so fascinated by Ike, and he was quite a character, but it was ordinary politics. Ike was a Likud. He was a right-winger who didn't want a single inch of their territory taken away from them. And I knew that I admired David Ben-Gurion, who said, give everything back. We don't need it. We want peace between Arabs and Jews. And so it was like Republicans and Democrats. And he teased me and I teased him because we weren't going to make big changes with what we thought, but he was determined to tell me that they gave away too much of the land.
Another question.
I believe you were a contemporary of Helen Thomas, though she's much younger than you, I think. How do you assess the end of her career with her last very provocative statement?
It's about Helen Thomas and her, how do you assess the end of her career and the provocative statement that she said?
Well, she was a Lebanese, so she was an Arab, and she felt that, I guess there was a strain of anti-Semitism in her upbringing, and she showed it. I knew her for years, but I never knew that she was anti-Semitic. We were, weren't great friends, but we said hello and we chatted a little bit. But she had power. She could have gone really very high if she hadn't lost, what was it, her brain, and showed that in her heart she hated Jews, or she was anti-Semitic. It wrecked her whole career. She lost her front page, her front seat in all the president's press conferences, in all the press conferences. Right.
Another question.
First of all, thank you so very much for keeping our story, the story of the Shoah, alive and teaching it to next generations. My question is, how do you view anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism? I would like to know how you compare that. Thanks.
The question is, how do you compare anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, and to discuss that?
It's a good question, but the two go hand in hand. If you're an anti-Zionist, very often it means that you just don't want Jews to have any power. You don't want, that you don't like Jewish people. So it's not too far apart. Anti-Semitism still exists. And we have to remember, or even there were people like Father, the priest in Detroit, and every Sunday the whole country sat paralyzed listening to him throw anti-Semitic trash in the air. We all turned on our radios to hear him, Father Coughlin, and he did a lot of damage. But I think that we survived it pretty well.
Another question?
After 19 books, which is quite an accomplishment, are you currently working on a 20th?
After 19 books, are you currently working on a 20th?
I don't have time. They're keeping me so busy with this movie. First, when they were making it, they were in my apartment practically 7 days a week. It wasn't time to answer email even, or to answer my mail. I'm still trying to catch up. There isn't time for that. But I feel that the movie has the real message, so I'm delighted to meet with you, even in this magical way.
Here's another one.
Yes, it seems you've traveled all over, and I was just wondering, while you were a foreign correspondent, did you have any fears, like, while traveling? What was your greatest fear while you were traveling as a foreign correspondent?
While you were traveling as a foreign correspondent, what were your greatest fears? And I think that maybe she's talking about the most fearful experience that you had as a foreign correspondent.
Oh, I had a number of close calls. One was in the War of Independence. Whenever there was a victory that the Israelis now would win, then the UN or somebody would call a truce. And the way you went from Jerusalem to Tel Aviv was all around. You had to wait for a convoy, and all the buses would line up and the cars and everything. And an Israeli army officer would lead this convoy, let's say from Jerusalem to Tel Aviv. They'd get to Latrun, the monastery. They'd stop there. Then the army man would get out and talk to the Father Superior in the monastery. The monks there weren't allowed to talk, only the Father Superior and one of his aides. And then when whoever was in charge at the time would lead the convoy through no man's land in front of Latrun and then get to the other border, which was going to Tel Aviv. So one night I was at a party in Jerusalem and I heard Mamie de Charlie, an officer from one of the old Russian families in Jerusalem. I heard him say, I'm leading a convoy to Tel Aviv tomorrow morning. So I said, Mamie, may I go along and be part of the convoy? Because I'd like to interview some people in Tel Aviv. He said, sure, you can sit with me in my Jeep. So we got as far as Latrun, and he said, I'm getting off here. And it was a very hot day. He said, there's a porch up there. You can't go into the monastery. I have to go in. I have a message to the Father Superior. But you can sit up there and get out of the Jeep and be, cooler. I said, that'll be fine. So I was very comfortable sitting on the terrace when suddenly an Arab approached and he was on the ground on his hands and legs, getting closer and closer, and he had a gun. And every minute that gun seemed bigger to me until it almost looked gigantic. And he was yelling at me, and of course, I didn't understand a word, but he had a terrifying face. So the one aide in that monastery who could talk rushed out and started yelling at him, paid no attention. So then Mamie came out, he's finished his work, and he sat down shocked because then the Arab aimed a gun at him and me back and forth. And we both, I think he, as well as I thought, he's going to shoot us both. But this aide said, you wait here. And he flew across till he got hold of the UN man, and he came back on a Jeep. He flew that Jeep, and he screamed to the Arab who listened. I don't know what he said, but the Arab began to go back on his hands and knees, and we were saved. But the next day, another convoy came from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. And this time they were ambushed. It wasn't one, it was a whole group of Arabs. And the army officer said, get down, everybody. They can't shoot you if you're on the ground. Get down. So most everybody got down. But there was an American engineer who stood up with an American passport, waving it. He said, they won't shoot me. Look, I have an American passport. My wife would never forgive me if I didn't go to Jerusalem. They shot and killed him. And then there was a woman, young woman, and she put her head up and they shot her. And later it turned out she was the daughter of, I think it was a Dutch banker. But the ambush probably thought that they were shooting me. So poor thing, they killed her. Well, look what we've been through this week with that beautiful congresswoman. You never know. So unknowing, an American engineer lost his life by not listening to lie down. That was only one of such narrow escapes.
Thank you. Thank you. Any other questions? Let's do about maybe two more.
How do you feel about the state of journalism today? And do you feel like it's changing for the better or for the worse?
How do you feel about the state of journalism today? And do you feel that it's changing for the better or for the worse?
Well, it's entirely different from the journalism that I was part of in the 50s, 60s. We were more polite. We all knew that FDR had no legs really, but we never mentioned it. We knew different congressmen had girlfriends or mistresses. We were cautious. We wanted to protect their privacy. That doesn't happen today. Everything is on the table. You can say anything you want, I'm afraid, and harm anybody's life even. But my feeling about journalists is that we have to write our stories with our hearts, our brains and our hearts. And we don't need all the scandals. But when we have a story like this terrible story this week, where we've all been praying that Gabby will stay alive, this beautiful young woman who had such a career that she could have become really high in Congress. We have to write about her with our hearts. And as journalists, we have to take photos and we have to take pictures with our heart. Steichen once said to me, Bruce, take your photos with your heart. And I wrote that on my heart. You have to do everything with your own passion. And then the truth is no. I think all of us have souls. What we must do is look into our souls and find out what tools we have. My tools are words and images, like cameras and my little Hermes typewriter. Of course, now we have laptops, but in those days we had these little good typewriters so that I could carry them wherever I went. And with words and images as my tools, I could help fight injustice. And all of us have tools. We just have to find them. And when we find them, then we should fight injustice.
Any more questions? Wow. I don't know where we could add to that. I think we'll make that, unless someone else has one more question. I think this time all we can say is Tulsa, Oklahoma, the Circle Cinema, and everybody in this room has been blessed beyond compare by the opportunity to talk with you. We are so privileged, Dr. Gruber, that you joined us today. Thank you so much, and we appreciate it beyond all compare. I think another round of applause would be appropriate.
That's great. Thank you so much. Thank you.